In the early 80s, I experienced something in a Munich museum that decisively influenced my artistic work. Enthused by a picture, I stepped up very close to it and set off the alarm. Acting in a space reserved for the appraising gaze, I understood then that when one physically enters the taboo zone of our culture, order is disturbed. This was the first indication that there is something potentially explosive in this space. Even today, after many years and after practicing various artistic approaches, I'm still interested in this zone. A second experience that remains very productive for me took place in a pizzeria. I was sitting at a table waiting for my food, a bit tired and distracted. I heard a sound and turned my head. At that moment, 2 dish covers being pushed on a trolley suddenly appeared in my field of vision. I at once perceived a gliding multipolar plane. The parallel motion of the 2 items created a moving intermediate space and opened up a field of perception in which a relativization of the normal order occurred by a combination of stationary and moving elements. At least for a moment, an indefinable zone was created. Part of my artistic practice is dedicated to making this paradoxical realm permanently accessible and investigating forms, ramifications, and mechanisms of action. My origins are in movement and dance, that is, in a realm where changes are decisive. Movement as a procedure of constantly changing form. Nevertheless, these phenomena are presumed to be medium-specific and are not further scrutinized as cultural techniques. For years, I developed thematically related performances and dances. My studies ended when I attempted to rid myself of all cultural techniques in a solo dance piece, through which I tried to discover new forms beyond the separation of subjective perception and objective reality. This entailed moving without knowledge, volition, or vision, with spontaneous presence in every moment. I regarded myself as a site of formal actions, and the types of movements that arose resulted from an interaction with the surrounding space, from perceiving it as an active sphere. I was thus able to embody in a single moment all of the aspects that our culture normally separates. An almost impossible task, and yet feasible with great concentration and a lengthy rehearsal period. At the end of the 80s, I turned toward a sculptural pictorial complex of works. With my autodidactic approach, I had to develop a working method for this, to me, unfamiliar realm, characterized by an interweaving of a growing flow of motifs and procedures. I attempted to employ spatio-temporal modes of perception, with which I was already familiar, in the field of pictorial and sculptural processes of creation. Turning toward a sculptural practice also implied consciously encountering layers of representation in our culture. The fixed, resting, and objectified were not merely taken for granted preconditions of visual expression, but rather were the themes. My starting point was the attempt to observe bodies taken in the physical sense of the word, and to create or draw them. At the same time, however, I wanted to consider positions in art history more closely. I would now like to introduce 2 bodies that have greatly preoccupied me in this regard. There is at first the thing that has almost become a general metaphor in art contexts. It is the bottle rack, the initial gesture with which Marcel Duchamp revolutionized art. This shift in context addresses the legacy of a specific concept of art, which produced the lineage of Duchamp, Magritte, and Brotars. Their procedures, influenced by the history of thinking and ideas, broach themes such as pictorial arrangement, representational and iconic functions, as well as the disciplined fragmentation of optics, and deal with a split in thinking which generated a unique field of art. For me, the most urgent attribute of the operation with the bottle rack is its immobilization. No longer active, the item has been removed from the physical world of use and now serves only as a vanishing point of speculation and projections. The context surrounding the bottle rack is conceptual. It seems to be sufficient to have a theoretical revaluation at one's disposal. In this respect, the dichotomy is maintained, and the Cartesian meditation on subject-object finds a new projection figure in the 20th century. The bottle rack was removed from the commodity flow of many similar things, but the next thing is a singular phenomenon in every respect. Let me introduce the so-called Großdruckbelastungskörper, high-pressure load body. This structure, built in 1941, is a relic of plans to redesign Berlin, then the capital of the Third Reich. To test the weight-bearing capacity of Berlin's sand, it simulated the weight of a section of the Arch of Triumph, which was intended to be built nearby. The load body weighs 12,500 tons, and except for the centrally located measuring compartments is cast in mass concrete. Its properties are those of a placeholder. Its function is one that every item possesses merely as a trait, namely to exert force, to be mere weight. In the terminology of ground engineering, this phenomenon is called a dead load. The size and shape of its form are defined by the specific weight of reinforced concrete, and after 1942, of sandblasted concrete. Steel was being used at the time for the production of arms. At the same time, the load body, which can neither be excavated nor blown up, is one of the most outstanding, in the truest sense of the word, elements of our cultural heritage. I see it as a final chord, as hubris, as an illustrative model and representation of an extreme, undiluted physicality to which the world of ideas stands in unmediated contrast. A landmark of totalitarian thinking, which produces only rigid singularities. Isolation and fixation are also central to the manner of operation here. A super thing, a kind of prima materia, in the sense of what object-constituting phenomena actually are. It's not only that the megalomaniac absurdity of this undertaking had the chance to penetrate consciousness during the 4 years of this testing load body's construction. I discovered that the employees of the same construction company were making new experiments with it in 1987. Day foreman, D-forms, were the first elements I engaged. With them, I was able to visualize the experiences I had gained from the load body. I set them in drawings as building blocks of structures with equidistant space between them. As such, they vaguely resembled stone weights, and the question arose, are these pre-functional or deformed forms? These experiments revealed a field that lacked intention and even any definition of an item's function, leaving only the parameters of number and location. In their purposeful ambiguity, the D-forms signify a mentality of occupying free space, of thinking and acting in fixed hermetic units. They are imagined as having cores, uncommunicative units, present masses. Intermediate spaces emerged from the amplification of the single element. Gradually, I became interested in the distinction between gaps and surroundings, or, in to borrow a concept from Heidegger, the Gegenstandsbezirk, the object realm. This zone is also the starting point for my reflections with respect to Bau 1, Construction 1, an experimental space with the aim of making space and object indistinguishable, so as to create modes of perception and experiences that are not based on the separation of the two aspects. At the beginning, there were, among others, studies of the history of general concepts like Ding, thing, Gegenstand, object, Objekt, object, but also commodity. In the first visualized models, one can still recognize the application of concepts from economic contexts. Here you see images of Warenblock, commodity block, and Mehrwert, surplus value. The basic formula of Construction 1 resulted from an act in which I arranged a number of things on a table in front of me in such a way that they physically touched one another, which means that they were situated in one another's Gegenstandsbezirken, or object realms, and they were assigned their positions according to their factual physicality. Consequently, speculation within the intermediate space was no longer possible. This was one of the prime gestures for dealing with art objects in the 80s, I think, which targeted readings, auras, and the history of meaning. By my bringing together, or better yet, pushing the objects together as a collective, they resisted the function of being protagonists, projection surfaces, or symbols. All properties of the objects are used to exert an influence on the logic of the resulting overall form. That they are so-called everyday objects is of the least relevance to me. I took them as found material, and among other things, physically brought them to the fore by using them as tripods and weights. Light's various qualities of appearance are also thematized. For instance, there's shining, glowing, sparkling, and radiating. A variable atmosphere is intended, an equally valued multitude through the balance of positioned objects and empty spaces, as well as the portions of light and shadow in the room. The movement of the visitors, the circling around, coming nearer and distancing, corresponds to the open structure of the sculptural field, which can never be totally felt, because a development while looking and moving in time is necessary. The light tracks are set up such that as soon as visitors enter the room, they intervene in the space with their physical presence. They temporarily become projection screens, and at the same time become part of the formations of light and shadow on the walls. In Construction 1, there is only one object. For me, the subject belongs to the object that it localizes and perceives from a distance. In this case, light is projected, and the object turns into an icon of genius that also appears on the wall. Light and shadow metaphors, and indeed all polarity phenomena, are connected to objects. In 1999, I developed a second construction entitled Red, Green, Gray. It was meant to create a sculptural milieu under various media conditions that, among other things, was inspired by this sentence by Gotthard Günther. A material issue that does not exist at the classic level of thinking must be shown to exist, one which, even once it has been discovered and formulated, fundamentally eludes the processing methods of our traditional thinking. The basis of my action was a simple formula with three components: red and green as a complementary color scheme that a third factor is added to. The material starting point was a number of jars with red and green cherry preserves. The title suggests that this is about coloring. That is, a material support must first exist to which color can then be applied as a trait. Initially, this was about inventing objects that would bear these color aspects. As such, I developed 12 types serving as application points. These basic forms are given structure and extension, but with the requirement to allow for growth and not to construct. All objects have the status of being a trait support. One can see that they are the result of simple actions. They are minimized bodies whose conditions of production remain visible. Often, they are merely embodiments of individual aspects that normally appear in clearly defined representational objects as the sum of properties. During the regularly held public discussions about these works, it became clear to me that the general understanding regarding the use of objects in art contexts oscillates between the position of a thing in itself and a commodity. Even the question pertaining to the core of things, which is a metaphysical speculation, was repeatedly posed. The core unites notions of origin and identity. The result of such a core-oriented perspective and thinking is centralist and hierarchical. To this end, I would like to quote Detlef Linke, who was a physician and professor of clinical neurophysiology at the University of Bonn, and who sadly passed away prematurely. Clearly, the guiding principle of Western culture, to be able to encompass everything in a circle with a center, could not tolerate the idea of a bicentric ellipse. I decided to approach these ideas empirically. I intended to develop a model through which the material consequences of dismantling traditional perception could be demonstrated. It was necessary to penetrate into the center of the object, to target all speculation, and to remove its core. In such extravagant endeavors, only a totally naive approach is helpful. I took an empty can and marked the center with a rod. Then I filled the vessel with plaster. After the casting mass cooled, I removed the core, and a hollow space remained. The object was created slowly in that my step-by-step actions allowed the material counterpart of the idea to settle. The resulting form is a negative of the idea's necessary constituent principles. These forms with removed core play a leading role in a third space I would like to quickly present so as to be able to speak about other elements I've been working with for years. In 1997, I developed a space for the Neue Galerie, New Gallery of the Museum in Kassel. It was opened a year later with the title Kasseler Raum, Ferne Zwecke, Kasseler Space, Distant Purposes, and is still on view to this day. For this work, I made use of depictions of objects stemming from a historical source, namely the Encyclopedia of Diderot and d'Alembert. In these illustrated books from the 18th century, an attempt was made to link all fields of human knowledge in a logical and genetic relationship. In more than 800 pages, depictions of all types of workshops, as well as an analytical register of every tool and tool part, even down to the smallest screw, can be found. Since this inventory could not be described only by means of language, it became necessary to include drawings. On the 207 panels hanging in the space, One sees individual sections of encyclopedic motifs from mechanical and technical realms that I selected according to morphological considerations. While I was working, I read the book Denkformen und Warenformen, Thought Forms and Commodity Forms by Alfred Sohn-Rethel, in which he writes of cultural characters and world-shapedness of being. In my opinion, both of these neologisms are applicable to these forms. The encyclopedia's objects constitute a formal vocabulary suitable for simple operations, similar to the structure and construction of language in bivalent logic. Deviations do not exist because only things that comply with a scientific conception of the world are covered. I am further interested in representations or objects that stem from philosophical systems and continue to appear as phantoms in popular science, such as Kant's thing in itself and Leibniz's monad. I'm concerned with the status given to the body in these models of the world, or rather with the schematics, constructs, and notions of the body that serve as transitional potentials in abstract removed systems, which are, as it were, embodiments of fixed points in one's intellectual disposition. To what extent does physicality extend into the construction of idealistic systems, and which forms, shapes, and figures are involved in the process? With the sentence, "The monads have no windows," Leibniz has, in my opinion, created a projection surface for notions in which a metaphysical speculation begins to stimulate the imagination as to appearances and constitutions. As such, the monad is, for me, an object of speculation coated with the conditions of scientific language, one of the remarkable assisting bodies that accompanies Occidental thinking, which is decidedly antagonistic to the body. Now I would like to present a project entitled Subject of Study that I realized with students of the Dresden Academy of Fine Arts in Munich and Vienna. A prerequisite for this project was half a year of continual training. I will now present the basic exercise and would like to invite you to mentally picture it. You are standing in a large room enclosed by walls, and there are 4 possible ways to move in the space. 1. Walk step by step, starting point, straight course, end point. 2. Walk straight ahead. The side walls drift past. The wall opposite gets closer. The wall forces you to stop moving. 3. Walk straight ahead. Be committed to the act of walking. Walk infinitely long. The wall appears as a form of resistance. 4. Walk backward toward the wall in expectation of the resistance. When you observe people performing this exercise, you can see how they step outside of their perception of a division as a moving subject within a definitively inactive space continuum, since they allow for the activity of the objective. The first exercise nevertheless affirms the notion of a sovereign person moving in a room, but already in the second version, walk straight ahead, the side walls drift past, the wall opposite gets closer, the wall forces you to stop moving. One sees that all the attention has moved from the image of the self to the relative experience of moving space. The common theme in versions 3 and 4 is the impenetrable zone just before the enclosing wall. Even if a serene, impartial way of walking were possible, the widening of consciousness faces another crisis in regard to the approaching wall, and a sort of agglomeration of knowledge, volition, and imagination occurs in these final stages in front of the wall. This is exactly the space that I first described with the example at the museum in Munich at the beginning of this lecture. This realm is a taboo zone in our culture, and it remains largely unexplored. And now for a description of the project subject of study. A complex of materials is brought together by a team of 12 during the course of preparation. These range from personal items to found fixtures and materials of various sizes and proportions. In the action space, chairs are set up in short, non-linear rows and small groups. The visitors take a seat there. The participants' goal is to act in this pool of materials for an hour without interruption. That is, the vigor of intervening and grasping is to be prolonged for an entire hour, a vigor that we normally only possess when predictable categories of meaning and purpose are present. In a state of permanent now, the people involved in the action act with full energy and without any intentional goal. That which constitutes every moment is the environment, that which is continually changing. This activity demands a maximum degree of unprejudiced perception in every instant from every actor because they have the closest relationship to the matter. That is, they're not allowed to pause or regard that which they could plan with any distance. Without exception, the objects are to be treated equally, moved, pushed, packed, and carried. Through the energetic speed of the action and the lack of concrete guidelines, the actors find themselves in an unconscious state on the perimeter between meaningful activity and chaotic drifting, both of which are to be avoided. Since the actors act self-forgotten, this in turn robs the visitors of any possibility to project. Those who act in this way produce space. It is no longer a space that only allows for an appraising gaze at what is hermetically placed, but rather it's an action space, a public space, characterized by the simultaneity of various perspectives. With their physical presence, the visitors are part of the action. They are a sort of action blockade that the dynamics of the action's currents break on, jam on, or need to bypass. And accordingly, each individual seat allows for a perception of relativized space over time. The issue is neither the relationship between human and object, nor the dramaturgical treatment of the separation of the two spheres. The separation occurs here on an entirely different level, namely, between material that is currently moving and material that is unmoved. The visitors must bear part of the burden of shifting the Archimedean point between material and material, since only thus can perception be exposed to what is actually happening. A transparent, continually manifold, concretely noisy, and, should it actually succeed, a highly poetic structure. Thus, a certain mental space can be empirically generated and maintained by both actors and visitors. Since these studies and their public presentations, in my class at the Dresden Academy of Fine Arts, we've been working on a method of empirically extending artistic themes, expanding them towards central themes of life that are of general relevance. To this effect, we attended philosophy of religion lectures at the Dresden Technical University from 2002 to 2005 and came into contact with the work of Emmanuel Levinas. Since then, his differentiation between Greek and Hebrew thinking, in which he elaborates the turn from theory toward ethics, has always been present in our class. Meanwhile, the traditional Jewish exegesis based on the Talmud has become an integral part of our work, namely, the training and cultivation of a paradoxical way of thinking, which remains present in layers that are continually superimposing on each other in different ways through a constant reinterpretation of the Torah. What was particularly inspiring for us in this was how the conversations of various people extended beyond spatio-temporal limitations. Time and again, the challenge, even in our art practice, is to transcend the standard polarities of our thinking and thus of our actions. To leave the old binary terrain is nevertheless not simple, since we immediately enter a non-hierarchical, multi-dimensional space where other laws apply. Constellations arise that move away from images and notions and lead toward phenomena of appearance, and I believe, to action. How can a handling of that which is invisible but still effective be nurtured? If appearance implies that there must be sufficient conditions for something to manifest itself, then it is something on the threshold between visibility and invisibility. This also means that all conditions that aid something in becoming an appearance are perceived as equal. The work has a setting. The creators in such an art practice trust in the activities of the unknown. They allow space, practice restraint, and thus give the foreign the possibility to appear. During the summer semester in 1999, our class conversations revolved around the skeleton in the closet. We were searching for a more precise perception of the area that our culture considers a transit zone, that zone between the inner motivation of a work and the conditions of its appearance in a spatio-temporal field. Which control mechanisms are part of the resulting form? What's with the inner swine? May it be included? This was a question about whether the dark side can be productive, and whether it is enough to simply translate it, either pictorially or conceptually. In a spontaneous reaction to these issues, and in order to fasten it, I bought a pig, which used to take the form of a real groomed boar's head, but is now simply an exemplar made of fabric. But, hanging in the studio, it's a grandiose mediation figure. For instance, it sharpens conversations and grants humor a playing field. The pig is the true teacher, and one of the most successful mediums in the effort to access the realm where themes, ways of working, blocks, and exaggerated ideas come from, with respect to the concept of art. But above all else, the pig helps to overcome the repressed individual contributions that our general division of consciousness brings about whenever a fearful mainstream conformism that leads to making assimilated art spreads into the conversation. The pig allows for the skeleton in the closet to be integrated, instead of being incessantly forced to express itself as a traditional cultural gesture. In this way, space is left for other themes. This pig then brought us into contact with our pleasure of being on the road. One of our theoretical guides has always been the passage from Hannah Arendt's The Human Condition, with her systematic analysis of three basic activities: labor, work, and action. In it, she describes the concept of action as the actual underlying human capacity that is irreversible and engenders forces without precedent in the household of nature. This new science cannot only be of theoretical capacity and then exemplarily transferred onto the physical world. Rather, it only results from a deed that is aware of its references and conditions, and determines processes whose outcome remains uncertain and unpredictable. From the beginning, class trips helped us focus on interweaving the students' individual works with a current common theme. The destination was, without question, Central and Eastern Europe. On the 8 to 10-day excursions, The goal was to continually carry out courses of action in a highly concentrated form, and thereby to consider everything, the excursion itself, the discussions, and individual actions from a formal point of view, and to purposefully put this into confrontation with the historical forms and cultural preserves of the respective geographic areas. Our question was, under what conditions do procedural structures emerge that might be valuable or meaningful in other ways? Our topics included, among others, identity in progress, worklessness, paradoxes, circular systems, and the playful gestures of the political. For instance, the class realized a dance project entitled Ethnic Structures in 2002 under the guidance of the Hungarian dance teacher Zoltán Bala in a village near Budapest. Our leading question for the project was, is it possible to draw conclusions from an authentic folk tradition of music and dance that are relevant to today's questions and problems? And is it possible to bypass reactionary, romantic, or cliched instrumentalizations? We were interested in embodying a form and structure that resulted from foreign states of awareness. One can also understand the traditional dances as an early form of an individual action of contemporaneous aimlessness. The projects are always assisted by local theorists. In this case, it was Ferenc Sebő, a music and dance researcher from Budapest. This was followed by 2 trips to Krakow and longer stays in Auschwitz in 2003 and 2004, where, through various means, we approached our own taboos rather than the formalization of memory and remembrance culture. It was during these travels that we first had the idea to take over and maintain a house as a branch of the University of Dresden. In the Jewish Center in Oświęcim, we found a photo that became a focal point for a project in Lublin a few years later. The photo is of a cobbler's stall in the Oświęcim market in 1932. In 2005, the figure of the king crystallized during class discussions. For this occasion, the students created sashes and crowns. Formal discussions followed at various times of the day and night, discussions in which the motif of the king was to be held in the mind and at the same time personified.
Alexandra Wegbahn, Manuela Henschke, William Wetzel, Yuka Urigasa, Elke Schindler, René Koch, Katja Hoffmann-Wildner, Michael Mader, Christoph Rodde, Solveig Navrot.
Our trip to Belgrade in May 2005, entitled Boulevard Alexander, was also developed from the exploration of the king motif. The point of departure was to rename the Street of Revolution as Boulevard Alexander, the last king of Serbia, in response to changes in the political climate in the year 2000. In Actions and Reflective Conversations, various fragments of historical and architectural, as well as archetypical images, such as that of the king, were addressed, and places marked by bombings were visited. And other places, like Hotel Slavia, including Peter Handke's perspectives, naturally. In Belgrade, our theoretical accompaniment was Dorothee Bauerle-Villert and the views of Abbey Warburg School. In the winter of 2005, We read a passage in Martin Buber's Tales of the Hasidim that triggered a starting point for a project that the students initially worked on and that is now being continued by other people on further travels with no end in sight. The catalyst was a text fragment about a revelation by the seer of Lublin, a Zadok from the 18th century, who makes the following prophecy while riding in a carriage through the forests of Lublin. At one point in the future, the entire revealed and hidden teachings, together with the settling down of the Shekinah, will be present here. The Shekinah is a mysterious and very productive motif in Jewish religion, with a variety of meanings. For instance, the hidden or female side of God, or bride. I remember that we were strongly affected by this description of the self-evident connection between a metaphysical state and a real space. The first impulse of our project was the casual remark, "We'll go and see whether she's already there." Only much later did it become clear to us that the most important part of this text is the point where it talks about driving. The seer was able to allow for the relativization of his position through the moving trees. That is, he accepted the activity of the surroundings and was thus able to announce the missing element of our culture. When we arrived in Lublin, a violent dispute arose about on which level we should begin. Both the seer and the Shekinah have the function, among other things, of staying in contact with open intuition. At first, the bridal theme generated so many banal, concrete ideas that I felt compelled to buy a dress in one of the many bridal stores in Lublin and hang it in our workspace to curtail the simple way of theory building and to concretely occupy the theoretical position. Many of the single actions were concerned with clothing at first. One student, who wanted to buy a dress at the market in Lublin, reported that a saleswoman dressed him without ridicule or irony. This was followed by works in the forest, where we attempted to track what the seer saw, the Shekinah in the forest of Lublin, under real conditions, and to manifest it, which means to not represent it. Here is a description of the action. Loose groups of chairs, specifically designed for this purpose, are aligned in the forest in a single direction. The actors take a seat. Then, the preparation of the space of action begins by sitting still and by viewing the conditions, sharpening perception. After some time, half of the group stands up and walks so deeply into the forest that to those who have remained seated, they seem to have been swallowed up by the trees. The actors in the forest begin to change their clothes and then walk back, but only to the point where perceived equal status between trees and people from the viewpoint of those sitting in the distance is established. As for the results, there's still much to think about. It is important in the projects that the poetic function is not being represented, but rather that empathy for places and characters arises. This is produced by the effort to venture into the realm of abstraction, that is, to go further into a seemingly paradoxical act triggered through linguistic, conceptual, or metaphorical elements, and while doing so, to observe what happens. The interventions must have the power to transcend the intensity of the linguistic realm of the imagination and become a genuine experience. In the winter of 2006, I saw a coat hanging in a tree on one of the rides from Warsaw to Lublin. since we had already extensively experimented with the wedding dress motif and the forest theme just a few kilometers away on the other side of the tracks, one could interpret this phenomenon, following poetic principles, as the appearance of the groom. This ghostly photo was taken on the way back, and the coat was adventurously recovered 2 weeks later by 2 female students and taken to Dresden, where it's been hanging in the class studio ever since. This was followed by extensive travels through the southeast of Poland and western Ukraine. The lasting impression from these trips was the constant change of location from old synagogues in remote villages and the often hardly recognizable places of terror to the concentration camps and the numerous small satellite camps. Back in Dresden, we first had to recover, also from our methodological parameters, and we decided to leave all of the Polish themes collected over the months to sprout wildly in a higgledy-piggledy project. Here are a few photographic impressions from One-Sut and Krasnik that were later used. At this point, we had 2 themes. We had long been fascinated by metaphors involving tables for law regulations and their interpretation in the Jewish tradition. And we had been referring to the seer of Lublin's legendary meal of pike, which he shared with his students on Friday evenings at the beginning of the Sabbath. Teaching and learning occurred during mealtime rituals, and playing with the fish head is an essential symbol of rank and meaning in the hierarchy of the community. The description of the action. We asked Dr. Holger Birkholz, an art historian at our academy, to fillet a fish for us and to grill and serve it. This was, of course, also meant to be a metaphorical fragmentation and analysis of the figure that we later consumed. Holger Birkholz agreed to enact the Rabbanit, the wife of the seer. Crowded around a small table, we sit and eat the pike with oversized cutlery, a reference to Torah reading aids. Bread and wine are also integrated. The seer, as a photocopied life-sized figure based on an engraving in the synagogue in One-Sut, sits at the head of the table. A participant from Berlin reads from a psalm collection by Rabbi Nachman of Bratslav into an amplified mobile phone. In the summer of 2008, when we grew tired of constantly being on the road, the idea of experiencing local travel emerged. What could be better than the Elbe, which flows right in front of our door? The template for this project was a highlight in Dresden, namely Ludwig Richter's painting Die Überfahrt am Schreckenstein, the ferry crossing at Schreckenstein, which he completed in 1837 and which hangs in a prominent place in the Staatliche Kunstsammlungen, the state art collections. The ferry seems to be standing on the stream with allegories. Above all, we were theoretically concerned with differentiating between the concepts of symbol and allegory in romantic contexts, but also with their agency as transmuting characters in pictorial sculptural processes, an idea that extern scientists introduced during preparatory seminars. The project ended with an actual ride on the river by a group of actors and a reworked complex of allegories of contemporary nature. The boat stood still for 30 minutes, and we took the movement of water as an opportunity to practice with active surroundings, that is, again, to let go of the concept of one's own deliberate actions in order to experience what then happens. Back to Poland. In the meantime, a relationship and joint projects have developed with an institution in Lublin, the Theatre NN, which is engaged with the city's history and Jewish heritage. Among other things, we are in the process of searching for the location of the house of the seer and his school, a project which even includes research material from a library of the local Lubavitch community in Brooklyn. Another project is the preparation and publication of a photo archive by Stefan Kjauschnia. This was completed in 2012 with the publication of 2 books. In the summer of 2009, we wanted to celebrate the marriage of 2 principles, represented by the coat and the wedding dress, namely wisdom and the self-sufficient wholeness. Here, a more thorough discussion was necessary. As always, it was about going to places and making an effort for a given period there to hold in mind and embody contents and connections that are actually divergent and irreconcilable. For this correlation, the school of the Seer of Lublin, which disappeared during the SS destruction of the Jewish quarter in 1942, played a very important role. In preparation for the action, The Wedding, we took a model reproduction of the original yeshiva to New York in March 2009 as a small opening celebration in the Carlton Arms Hotel Lounge, which had been transformed into the Lublin Lounge for the occasion. Our New York collaborators would then send photos of this event on the actual wedding day 2 months later via MMS, so that the very first images of the school could be seen in Lublin on a laptop in a kind of telematic inclusion. The wedding took place on a field on the outskirts of the city of Lublin. Central to it was a sales booth that we created from a photo of the market in Oświęcim. The roof was a cloth, like a chuppah, that we printed with motifs from the Jewish Lublin. The 3 main actors wore coats made of printed fabrics that were reanimated using photos of Taylor's advertisements in Lublin taken by Stefan Kjauschnia in the 30s. Hats from Pan Wojcik, the oldest hat store in Lublin, were chosen, and friends, colleagues, and the musician Eva Grochowska came together. After this project, I worked further on the Lublin topics, alone at first, focusing especially on resonances with the archive of Stefan Kjauschnia. His photos display with ease something I've been trying to uncover in my artistic practice for years. The diversity of the levels of reproductions and actions that I'm trying to analyze in order to track possible changes is seen here as a normal, everyday scenario. Due to the unobtrusive inventory of the photographer, in which there is no appreciable desire to make anything count as representative, layers appear depicting urban spaces that do not seem to be marked by alienation. The characteristics of the advertisements, the equalizing coexistence of letters and product images, demonstrate the greatest variety of abstraction in a flowing coexistence, producing an equally streaming structure. The picture and word scenarios against the architecture, with its projections, entrances, and dark depths, would provoke sentimentality if it weren't for that incessant stream of people crossing the line of sight. This zone, usually an objectifying area between viewer and figures for the sake of representation, is here full of life. The motivation of my first work are the tailor's advertising billboards in Ulica Nova. They depict painted cloth bales lying on top of one another, crossed, combined with associated decorative suggestions. These gestures of fabric presentation look like abstract bodies. After studying fabrics at the Textile Museum in Łódź, I reconstructed the colors of the 30s. In addition, figures composed from numerous historical epochs of the Occident were created for this context. The heads are adaptations of face-like representations of the sun from 16th century engravings. The torso is composed using cloak and coat models from the Illustrated Encyclopedia by Diderot and d'Alembert from the 18th century, and the limbs are from Cesare Ripa's Iconology from the 17th century. These figures, I call them friendly thinking babes, have an expansive theoretical aura, but are very easily understood by today's inhabitants of Lublin, and have opened many doors for me. For instance, the doors of the shops in Ulica Lubartowska, from where I can finally see the proverbial other side. I intend to continue exploring the work of Stefan Kjauschnia in the coming years, to make it productive both in my artistic practice and teaching. The themes and narratives of Jewish mysticism I have encountered during my research and travels carry within themselves the dynamics of a pending paradigm shift. Space, for me, is no longer an artistic speculative factor, but rather a place where, if we're able, we can develop an exemplary divergent perspective, where the classic division between subject and object can be transcended, and from which visions of a transcultural practice can arise.